In this video, we will review the carbon and nitrogen cycles. So what is the carbon cycle related to energy and matter flow? First, let's look at the steps of the carbon cycle. Think back to cellular respiration and photosynthesis. All organisms conduct cellular respiration in order to make energy. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So carbon dioxide is released when organisms exhale. Carbon dioxide is also released through combustion of fossil fuels. So as we drive our cars, as we are fueling all of the things that are necessary for us to have all of our modern luxuries, we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This carbon dioxide is then used for photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide enters through the stomata on the bottom of the leaves of plants and then is then used by the plants in the chloroplasts to conduct photosynthesis. This carbon dioxide and water is then converted into glucose and oxygen. Oxygen gets released through the stomata, and then the sugar is used by the plant for cellular respiration again, or it is then eaten by another organism. Carbon then gets transferred into that next organism through the process of eating. Do you see this mass is being obtained by another organism through the process of eating, transferred? Or energy is also being transferred because remember, sugar is chemical energy, which is the food used for all of the life processes of an organism. So the energy transfer occurs when an organism eats that sugar from that plant. And remember that glucose is C6H12O6. So there are 6 atoms of carbon found in each molecule of glucose. Remember that the products of photosynthesis are glucose and oxygen. So carbon is released back into the atmosphere through the process of respiration, breathing, or also through the process of decomposition. As organisms are decomposed, carbon dioxide gets released back into the atmosphere. Decaying or decomposing organisms can also be stored under the ground in the form of fossil fuels, which then can be used through the process of combustion in a form of energy. This combustion then releases the carbon from that fossil fuel in the form of carbon dioxide. And then the whole cycle just goes back and starts over again, because that's what a cycle is. It circulates. So what are the important organisms in the carbon cycle? Well, plants, animals, bacteria, and other decomposers such as fungi. So what's the purpose of the carbon cycle? Carbon is necessary to create mass in all organisms because remember, all of the biomolecules contain carbon. Carbohydrates are CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And nucleic acids add phosphorus to that, right? So it's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So without carbon, we can't make all of those molecules that are necessary for an organism to actually be formed. Sometimes disruptions to this cycle can occur. So what is the result of a disruption to the carbon cycle? If more carbon is produced through overpopulation or through pollution, then the producers in the environment can actually process through photosynthesis. There will be an excess of carbon in the atmosphere, which then cannot be processed and brought back into the organisms through the process of photosynthesis. This excess is dangerous to an environment. So let's take a look at a diagram of the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide is represented by CO2, and it enters the producers. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is then used by the producers to produce sugar through the process of photosynthesis. The consumers then eat the sugar found inside of the producers for energy, and then they are either eaten or they die, and then return that carbon dioxide back into the environment through the process of decomposition or throughout their lifespan through cellular respiration and then breathing out that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is also released through the combustion of fossil fuels, which is represented by this house and the smoke coming out of it. This releases the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere and the cycle continues again. Now let's review the nitrogen cycle and how it relates to matter and energy flow in an ecosystem. We'll start by reviewing the steps of the nitrogen cycle. The first step of the nitrogen cycle is nitrogen fixation. Bacteria converts nitrogen from the atmosphere into ammonia. The second step is called nitrification. This is where ammonia is converted into nitrites and eventually nitrates. The third step is ammonification. Bacterial decomposers and fungi break down the nitrogen waste from decomposing plants and animals to produce ammonia. The fourth step is denitrification, where bacteria take these nitrogen compounds and break them back down into nitrogen gas, which is released back into the atmosphere. There are some organisms that are important to this cycle. These organisms are bacteria and other decomposers, and the bacteria that are found in the root nodules of legumes or beans. These bacteria are used to convert nitrites into nitrates, and then are also used to convert these complex nitrogen molecules into nitrogen that is released in gas form into the atmosphere. Again, remember that these are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So what is the overall purpose of the nitrogen cycle? Well, nitrogen is necessary to form amino acids, which make proteins, which are necessary for pretty much all life functions in an organism. And also, they're needed to form nucleic acids. Remember, DNA and RNA must have nitrogen in the nitrogen bases, which are the basis for the genetic code. The order of these nitrogen bases determine the traits of that organism. So without nitrogen, we wouldn't be able to make life. Now let's talk about some results of disruptions to the nitrogen cycle. Farmers use fertilizers to help their plants grow because they need nitrogen. So fertilizers contain nitrogen. These then get leaked into the water, the groundwater, or runoff can lead to ponds. This increase in the amount of nitrogen in the water can cause disruptions in the ecosystems of those ponds. Nitrogen can also be added to the atmosphere in excess, causing acid rain when mixed with water in the form of precipitation. There are a couple different diagrams in your resource folder that represent the nitrogen cycle in various ways. Please reference these documents so you can further your knowledge on the nitrogen cycle. Now let's look at some disruptions in typical matter and energy flow within ecosystems. There are some very specific consequences that result from disruptions in these cycles. Remember that carbon dioxide is released as people breathe out carbon dioxide, and that also we release carbon dioxide through the combustion of fossil fuels. The more that we release into the environment, the less we can actually use through the process of photosynthesis, and there becomes an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Remember that plants and trees help us to use this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and to put it into our sugar that then can be used as energy. So deforestation and cutting down trees is really counterproductive. We need these trees to help us to process that carbon dioxide into a usable form and to release oxygen so that we can breathe it in. This disruption to the carbon cycle will reduce the amount of organisms that will be able to survive in an ecosystem because there will be more carbon dioxide in the air and less oxygen. And there will also be less food for those organisms to eat in the form of sugar. Now let's look at some disruptions to the nitrogen cycle in a little bit more detail. Algal blooms are the result of excess nitrogen being added to the water. This has some very negative side effects. Algal blooms are caused by excess nitrogen in the water due to fertilizers. So you'll find this usually around farms. Algal blooms are when there is an increased amount of algae in a pond or in a lake. We would think that this would be a good thing because algae are producers in aquatic ecosystems. Algae conduct photosynthesis, which creates sugar. As the growth of algae increases, nutrient depletion occurs, which may cause other organisms in the pond or lake to die because they don't get enough of those nutrients. Acid rain is the result of excess nitrogen in the atmosphere mixing with water in the form of precipitation. The last disruption that we will review is the removal of a keystone species. What is a keystone species? A keystone species is key or vital to an ecosystem. It is either a producer or consumer that plays a vital role in maintaining homeostasis or balance within an ecosystem. The removal of this keystone species will either cause the ecosystem to change significantly or cease to exist. Thank you for watching this video. Please make sure to use the resource folder for more information so that you can also get more practice so that you can master this content.